For thousands of years, humans have wrestled with questions about the divine, questions about power, morality, and the limits of creation. But there is one question, so simple in words, yet so tangled in logic, that it has baffled philosophers, theologians, and skeptics alike. Can God create a rock so heavy that even he cannot lift it? This is not a question about geology. It's not about actual rocks. It's a thought experiment, a paradox, designed to explore the limits of omnipotence. The earliest forms of this question appear in medieval philosophy, when scholars debated the nature of divine power. If God is all-powerful, can he do anything? Even the impossible? The great Islamic philosopher Al-Ghazali wrestled with this question around 1,000 years ago. In his book, The Incoherence of the Philosophers, he writes, "If God wills something to come about, that will happen. But if it is impossible that something should come about, God will not will it to come about." In other words, if God can create an unliftable rock, then there's something he cannot do, lift it. If he cannot create the rock, then there's something he cannot do, create it. Either way, his power seems limited. But omnipotence means infinite power, right? How can God be both all-powerful and limited in any way? So the question of the unliftable rock became a kind of logical booby trap for would-be theologians. And over the centuries, theologians have tried to dismantle it in a number of ways. The most straightforward response is that lifting heavy things is not what God does. Why bother? He created physics. Or another, making an unliftable rock isn't really a thing. Rocks don't have weight in the same way that people do. To lift something is to exert a force greater than its weight. So if God made a rock with no weight, technically, he could lift it. It's just that the rock wouldn't be very useful as a thought experiment. Many modern theologians, meanwhile, argue that omnipotence doesn't mean the ability to do the logically impossible. In other words, God cannot make a square circle. He cannot make 2 + 2 = 5. And he cannot make an unliftable rock. For an all-powerful being, because the concept itself is meaningless. As C.S. Lewis once put it, nonsense remains nonsense even when we talk about God. That didn't stop philosophers from trying. William Lane Craig, a contemporary apologist, argues that the paradox disappears if we think about infinity. Since God is infinite, he can create an infinitely heavy rock, meaning a rock whose weight is always greater than any force imaginable. Therefore, it follows that he could also lift it. Since he is infinite, he could lift an infinitely heavy rock. But skeptics argue that theologians are simply hiding behind definitions. J.L. Mackie, an Australian philosopher, argued that the paradox reveals a deeper truth, that our human concepts of God are internally inconsistent. Since the idea of a rock and the idea of lifting that rock both depend on the idea of a being who is strong enough to lift rocks, you can't have one without the other. To suggest otherwise is self-contradictory. In other words, the idea of an all-powerful God is in some sense meaningless. If he's too weak to lift a rock, he's not all-powerful. If he's too strong to lift a rock, he's not all-powerful. There's no way to conceive of an all-powerful being. Not only does this undermine the idea of omnipotence, it undermines the idea of omniscience, omnipresence, and all the other omni-concepts that theologians love to slap onto God. According to Mackie, the omnipotence paradox exposes the futility of talking about God in human terms. So does that mean that theologians should stop talking about God altogether? Well, no. That's why the omnipotence paradox continues to fascinate theologians, skeptics, and everyone in between. It forces us to confront the limits of our own understanding, to grapple with concepts like infinity and nothingness, and to ask ourselves, can an all-powerful being create rules so absolute that even he must obey them? Can God make himself cease to exist? Can he make evil good? The paradox challenges us not only to think about God, but to think better. After all, Thinking about thinking is what philosophy is for.